Stream. I apologize for the technical issues we had. My internet literally crashed just as I pressed live. No worries. Welcome, as I said, to Lunch with Books live stream. Hopefully you can all hear us. Our People's University live stream continues this Thursday with physical science. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of physics from Newton to Einstein. That's 6:30 this Friday with Dr. Stacy Kefalis Vargas, who is a VMI professor of physics and went to college with me. And then next Tuesday, we will have Barbara Ellen Smith, whose book is called Digging Our Own Graves, Coal Miners and the Struggle Over Black Lung Disease. This is a new edition of that book, and it's a classic of coal mine black lung disease literature. So please join us next week, February 16 at noon. Now, today, our guest is Jill L. Newmark. She is an independent historian and former exhibition specialist and curator at the National Library of Medicine's History of Medicine Division. She's curated several exhibitions, including Binding Wounds, Pushing Boundaries, African Americans in the Civil War Medicine, and with There goes my internet again. Hopefully it'll stay. Jill has published articles in Prologue magazine, the quarterly publication of the National Archives, and Traces magazine of the Indiana Historical Society. She is currently working on a book on African American Civil War surgeons, which she's going to tell you about today. So here she is without further delay, Jill Newmark.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks to Sean and the Ohio County Public Library for this opportunity to present to you. Just so that you know, Sean is going to be running my slide presentation because of technical issues, so you'll hear me say the word next a couple of times, more than a couple of times, so that's why I'm interjecting the word next. And next. Splendid among the shabby field hands, the sight of his uniform stirred the faintest heart to faith in the new destiny of the race, for Dr. Augusta wore the oak leaves of a major on his shoulders. These words describe the appearance of African-American Civil War surgeon Alexander T. Augusta at the mustering of the first two companies of black soldiers in Washington, D.C. in 1863. The sight of an African-American man in an army officer's uniform was controversial, to say the least. His appearance stirred pride in many of the formerly enslaved as well as free blacks, but it also provoked anger in others, both white and black. It is clear that the appearance of a black officer in a uniform stirred the deepest emotions, and it represented the beginning of a change in the role and position of African Americans in America. Next. The story of African American medical personnel that served during the Civil War, it's an often neglected but a very important part of Civil War history. There's not been much written on the subject, and many histories of Civil War medicine often overlook the participation and contributions African Americans made between 1861 and 1865. There are few personal accounts of Black surgeons, nurses, and hospital workers that exist, and materials are often hidden among the thousands of Civil War records that are contained in repositories throughout the country, including the National Library of Medicine, where I formerly worked, and the National Archives here in Washington, D.C. This presentation today will follow the journey of discovery that will introduce you to 3 of the 14 known African-American men who served as surgeons during the Civil War and how their stories are revealed through their service in one hospital in Washington, D.C. Next. More than 200,000 African Americans served in the Union Army, but there were only 14 that were surgeons. To give you a framework for the story, I just want to give you a few little basics about Civil War surgeons. Next. Surgeons serving the Union Army, they were either commissioned military officers or private physicians who entered into a contract with the U.S. Army as acting assistant surgeons. Next. Surgeons held the rank of major, while assistant surgeons were captains or lieutenants. Next. Most regiments were required to have medical personnel that included at least one surgeon, 2 assistant surgeons, as well as a contingent of enlisted men. Next. By the end of the war, there were over 12,000 surgeons that served in the Union Army, and they treated over 400,000 sick and wounded soldiers. But of the 12,000, we only know of 14 that were African American. Next. At the start of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers to join the fight for the Union. There were many African Americans that were eager to join, but they were restricted in their participation because of their color. Next. As the war lingered on, military resources for both Union and Confederate troops, they were strained and dwindling, so the enlistment of Black soldiers really became inevitable. Next. In 1863, after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army and the Union began to recruit and enlist Black men as soldiers, and they established what's known as the United States Colored Troops. As many African Americans were seeking a role to play and to play an active role in the war and in the fight for freedom, there were some Black physicians who were also determined to serve as surgeons for the newly formed colored troops. Of the more than 12,000 surgeons that served, like I said, where there were only 14. And of those, I'll go through a little bit. There were 2 that received military commissions. The other 11 were either contract surgeons or volunteers that were appointed as acting assistant surgeons. Alexander T. Augusta, that you see here, he received a commission as a surgeon on April 4th, 1863, with the rank of major. He was later breveted a lieutenant colonel for his more meritorious service, and he was among 2 African Americans, highest ranking African Americans in the Civil War. Next. You can click until all of them show up, and I'll just talk a little bit about them. There was John Van Soley de Grasse was the other commissioned officer, commissioned April 28th, 1863, and he was the only one to serve with his regiment in the field. This is because white surgeons did not want to serve with African Americans in the field and did not want to be subordinate to a Black man. Next. You're going to click a few more times. As you can see, you'll start to see just names pop up after the next. You can continue to click. These are all the images that we have that I've been able to locate of these surgeons. So the others did serve, but have not been able to locate any images. Okay, next. As I mentioned, since white surgeons and officers would not serve alongside Black surgeons in the field or be their subordinates, excuse me, African American surgeons were mostly assigned to military-run hospitals or recruiting stations for Black soldiers. This included Contraband and Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C., in Arlington, Virginia, and in Savannah, Georgia, as well as recruiting stations in towns like Baltimore, Indianapolis, and Hilton Head. Next. The appointment of Black surgeons, as you can see, Camp Nelson was a recruiting station as well. Next. Since white surgeons and officers served, let me just say the appointment of Black surgeons was really based primarily on race. The federal records that we can find documenting work assignments of these surgeons indicate duty stations at facilities that treated only African Americans. We know of no Black surgeons that were assigned to white-only hospitals. So you can see here, it's Contraband Hospital in Washington, D.C., which was also became known as Freedmen's Hospital. And then we had Benjamin Bozeman, that was at the recruiting rendezvous in Hilton Head, and a few other locations. Excuse me. Next. One of the main hospitals where more than half of the African American surgeons served during the war, it was Contraband Hospital in Washington, D.C. It was first known as Camp Barker. It was established by the Union Army in 1862, really to provide temporary housing, food, and medical care to the thousands of formerly enslaved men, women, and children. They had a tented camp and hospital, and it really became the center of contraband relief efforts in the city. It was one of the few hospitals to serve African Americans in Washington. Next. Contraband Camp and Hospital, it was located on a parcel of swampy land in northwest Washington, D.C., which at that time was a very much more remote area of the city. Within this camp, there were thousands of contraband that found refuge and medical care. It was common to see 40 or to 50 arrivals in a single day. And by the end of 1863, the camp had processed over 15,000 individuals. Next. Excuse me. The conditions of the camp were not very good. They were poor. Life there was difficult. The camp was located, as I mentioned, on a damp, swampy piece of land. That damp, swampy land, combined with a lack of an adequate supply of fresh water, it really created a breeding ground for illnesses. The camp residents and hospital staff were susceptible to sicknesses like diarrhea and respiratory infections. In addition, their living quarters were very small. Sometimes it was occupied by 12 to 14 people. And in those quarters, they cooked, they ate, they slept, and invariably they contracted diseases and illnesses from being in close contact in poor and overcrowded conditions. When the residents became ill, they were often moved to the hospital for treatment. Next. The hospital, it was equipped with over 100 beds, and it was staffed by at least 2 surgeons, several nurses. They had clerks, stewards, and matrons there. Next, you can click twice. There were separate wards for women and men, as well as a separate tented ward for those that had smallpox. Next. The Contraband Hospital, it primarily served the Black civilian population, but it also tended to sick and wounded soldiers of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops. Next. On occasion, there were white patients that were treated mostly in the smallpox ward, and those were generally relief workers or hospital staff. Next. When the hospital was first established in 1862, most of the cooks, the laundresses, and the nurses were African American, while the majority of those in positions of authority, next, such as head nurses and surgeons, were white, as was typical of most Black-only hospitals. Edwin Bentley was the surgeon in charge of Louverture Hospital, which was established in Andrea specifically for Black soldiers and civilians. Next, the appointment of the first African-American surgeon in charge, Alexander T. Augusta, in May 1863, it began a shift in the racial makeup of hospital staff, with Blacks taking over leadership positions from whites. The appointment of African-American surgeons and assistant surgeons at the hospital represented the first time that Blacks served in positions of authority at any hospital in the United States. Alexander Augusta is probably the best known among the Black surgeons who served at Contraband Hospital. He was the first African-American physician to receive a commission as a surgeon in the United States Army. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. He was born free in Norfolk, Virginia in 1825, and he had a desire to become a physician. He couldn't do that in the United States because of his color, so it took him on a journey that brought him to Canada, where he received a medical degree from Trinity Medical College in Toronto in 1856. Next. After he saw an announcement in the local Toronto newspaper that the United States would be forming colored troops to fight in the war, he was moved to answer the call of his native country. Next. And in January 1863, he wrote letters to both Abraham Lincoln and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, next, requesting an appointment as surgeon to some of the colored regiments or as a physician to some of the depots of freedmen. He said in his letter, "I was compelled to leave my native country on account of prejudice against color for the purpose of obtaining a knowledge of my profession. Next, but I am now prepared to practice it and would like to be in a position where I can be of use to my race." As the first African American considered for a position as a surgeon with the Army Medical Department, his application was met by numerous delays because of confusion, and there was a hesitance on the part of the Army to accept an application from a Black physician. Next. Meredith Clymer was the president of the Army Medical Examining Board, and he noted in a letter to the Surgeon General, Brigadier General William Hammond, that he believed an error had been made in accepting Augusta's application because Augusta was, quote, of African descent. And so Clymer requested direction on how the board should proceed with Augusta's examination. Next. General Hammond referred the matter to Secretary of War Stanton and recommended that the invitation be recalled. Next. It was only after an order to examine Augusta was passed down from Secretary Stanton that Augusta finally received an examination, which he passed fairly easily. And on April 4th, 1863, he was appointed surgeon with the U.S. Army and given the rank of major. Next. Excuse me. Augusta's first assignment was at Contraband Hospital, which was located at Camp Barker, as its first African-American in charge. That made him the first African-American to head a hospital in the United States. Now, as a surgeon in charge, he was responsible for hospital administration. He ordered supplies and rations. He controlled sanitary procedures. He hired and trained staff. He performed surgery. And of course, he treated patients. Now, once Augusta was in charge, it became clear to the Army Medical Department that all of the white assistant surgeons and head nurses would have to be reassigned and replaced by African Americans. Because they believed that Augusta could not be permitted to supervise white hospital staff, and most of the white staff refused to serve under the direction of a black man. Next. In a letter to R.O. Abbott, who was the medical director of Washington, to the Surgeon General in May 1863, Abbott pointed out that as difficulty will arise in placing Surgeon Augusta over the hospital staff as at present organized, next, I am of opinion that the interest of the government will best be served by procuring, if practicable, colored in lieu of white assistant surgeons for Surgeon Augusta. So Augusta arrived at the hospital with his own surgical instrument kit and likely this handbook for the military surgeon. Next. Which this handbook for the military surgeon was owned by Augusta and is part of the History of Medicine Division collections at the National Library of Medicine. It is one of several books that were identified as belonging to Augusta. Along with his appointment as surgeon in charge, next, Augusta was permitted to make some staffing changes. And he did that by beginning to request to hire fellow black surgeons, William P. Powell, next, and Anderson Abbott on contract as his assistant surgeons. Next. He also hired camp residents as nurses, cooks, and laundresses. This was not uncommon that the patients that had recuperated and the people that were living there would be hired for tasks and jobs such as nurses, cooks, and laundresses. While he served there as surgeon in charge, he really demonstrated a commitment to trying to better the conditions at the hospital and also trying to help the residents and the patients that were under his care. He not only treated their illnesses, but he tried to improve their overall condition. Many of the contraband who had arrived there, they were illiterate and penniless, and they didn't have any source of income. So when he saw this, their destitute condition, he tried to provide hospital work for as many people as he could, or he tried to help secure employment for them outside the camp. Next. In the pension application of African-American nurse Jane Isabella Saunders, who served at the hospital, Saunders' daughter recalled how Dr. Augusta had hired her mother. He said, "For I remember how he pitied my mother with 6 children when she found my father was dead, and he took 2 of my brothers to work for him and got a place with us, with the lady next door." Augusta served at the hospital for 6 months before he mustered in with his regiment, which was the 7th Infantry of the USCT at Camp Stanton in Benedict, Maryland, and he became its regimental surgeon. Next. Now, Augusta arrived at Camp Stanton. His arrival was met with controversy. He was the ranking medical officer among the 4 USCT regiments there, and he was confronted with several white medical officers who did not want to be subordinate to a black man. There were 7 white assistant surgeons next, including these 3, that wrote a letter to Lincoln, the president, protesting the position of Augusta at the camp. In their letter, they stated, "When we made application for position on the colored service, the understanding was universal that all commissioned officers were to be white men. Judge our surprise when upon joining our respective regiments, we found that the senior surgeon of the command was a Negro." Next. They went on to say, "We claim to be behind no one in a desire for the elevation and improvement of the colored race in this country, and we are willing to sacrifice much in so grand a cause as our present positions may testify. But we cannot, in any cause, willingly compromise what we consider a proper self-respect, nor do we deem that the interests of either the country or the colored race can demand this of us. Such degradation we believe to be involved with our voluntarily continuing in the service as subordinate to a colored officer. We therefore most respectfully yet earnestly request that this unexpected, unusual, and most unpleasant relationship in which we have been placed may in some way be terminated. Well, shortly thereafter, Augusta was detached from his regiment and assigned duty to examine Black recruits at the recruiting rendezvous for colored troops in Baltimore, although he did remain the regimental surgeon of the 7th Infantry of the USCT, but he never served directly with his regiment. Next. 6 months later, Augusta was ordered to a special duty in the Department of the South, where he served for a short time in Beaufort, South Carolina, before he went to Savannah, Georgia, to direct Lincoln Freedmen's Hospital, which was formerly the Poorhouse and Hospital. He was mustered out of the Army in 1866, but continued as contract surgeon until March 1867, and in July of that year, he received a breveted lieutenant colonel rank for faithful and meritorious service. And it made him one of 2 highest-ranking African Americans to serve during the Civil War. Next. And that's the poorhouse that was the Freedmen's Hospital in Georgia. Next. After leaving the Army, Augusta established a private practice in Washington, D.C. at his home at 13th and L Streets Northwest. And next, he accepted a teaching position at Howard University's newly formed medical department in 1868, where he taught anatomy and he lectured on diseases of the skin. Next. This page from Augusta's prescription pad shows the location of his office along with his office hours. But it's interesting to note that there's a little sketch of what appears to be a pelvis. We can only assume that he was discussing something with a patient or another doctor and did this. And then he took this prescription pad thing and stuck it in one of the books that were donated to the library, and that's how we found it. He then became a professor of anatomy at the Medical College at Howard University, and he was the only African American among the first 5 medical college faculty there. Next. You can see him here at the left. The second from the right, I show later on, is Charles Purvis. This, I believe, was from 1870, and he was another African American that served during the Civil War, as well as on the faculty of Howard. Next. This is a double-sided handwritten page that I found along with the prescription pad in a book that he had called Human Physiology. And it's likely that he used this page of notes to prepare for his teaching position. Next. Augusta's battle for equality didn't stop after the war. His efforts continued, including battling for and ultimately being denied admittance to the Medical Society of the District of Columbia, next, along with 2 fellow Black surgeons who had served during the war, both Charles Purvis and Alpheus Tucker. They did try to join the Medical Society of the District of Columbia in order to attend the American Medical Association and were denied admittance. Next. Augusta died at his home on December 21st, 1890, and he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was the first African-American military officer to be buried there. Next. I put this in because it's a very interesting part of the story. In his will, he had left a provision for money to fund a stained glass window to honor Secretary of War Edmund Stanton, who he felt was instrumental in securing him a commission to serve as a surgeon in the Army. That provision was honored by Augusta's wife, Mary, who provided the funds to create this window, which can be seen in St. Mary's Church in Washington, D.C. After Augusta left Contraband Hospital in October 1863, there were 2 other African Americans that replaced him as surgeon in charge, William P. Powell Jr. and Anderson Abbott, and I'll tell you a little about them next. In November 1863, William P. Powell Jr. took charge of the hospital, and he served in that capacity for about a year. He was freeborn of an African-American father and Native American mother in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1834. Next. His father was William P. Powell Sr., who was a well-known staunch abolitionist, next, and who operated several boarding houses for black seamen in New Bedford and New York City. And those locations provided refuge for tired sailors as well as for the formerly enslaved that were leaving their enslavement. At the age of 16, while he was living in New York, he found work as an apothecary, and this piqued his interest in becoming a physician. Now, in 1850, with the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Act by Congress, next, William P. Powell Sr. decided to move his family to England and settled in Liverpool. The Fugitive Slave Act stated that all fugitive slaves must be returned to their masters, and all citizens were expected to comply with this new law. So basically, anyone could be considered a suspected fugitive slave based solely on the testimony of their slave owner. Suspected slaves were not eligible for a trial. They were not permitted to testify on their own behalf, and this led to many free blacks becoming enslaved. Now, during his time in England, the younger Powell here, William P. Powell Jr., he obtained his medical training at the University of Liverpool, next, and at the Coombe and Peters Street Auxiliary Lying-in Hospital in Dublin. He also became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. About 10 years after they arrived in 1861, they returned to the United States, and Powell set up a medical practice. And then 2 years later, he applied for a position as a surgeon with the Union Army. Next. Powell didn't receive a commission, but he did receive a contract as an acting assistant surgeon. And in May 1863, he was assigned duty at Contraband Hospital. And then he joined Alexander Augusta at that time. Next. In this entry, which is from a publication called The Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, we can see that William Powell Jr. is listed as a surgeon who performed an amputation on a soldier from the 2nd Regiment of the USET in 1863. So we can see that there is evidence that he did serve time there. Next. While he was surgeon in charge, he made some attempts to improve the camp, including submitting a request for perimeter fencing, which would protect the camp's property. And although he had some successes, he faced many challenges, both administrative and personal. He was troubled by accusations about his drinking habits and treatment of patients by some nurses. Next, Cornelia Hancock was a white volunteer nurse at the hospital, and she had said that Powell was neglectful when treating patients. Next, Anderson Abbott, who was another black assistant surgeon, filed a complaint about Powell, and he said that he indulged too freely in spirituous liquors to a degree which renders him totally unfit to attend his duties. Now, Powell also made similar charges against Abbott, as well as against another black surgeon named John H. Rapier Jr., but none of these charges were substantiated, nor the charges brought against Powell. But despite any of these accusations, he remained the surgeon in charge until he left in November 1864. Now, after Powell departed, next, he spent some time as a physician, but he had several disabilities which prevented him from really continuing in his profession. Those included partial deafness, rheumatism. He lost his middle finger. He had an injury to his elbow, which limited the use of his right arm. Excuse me. So as a result of his inability to work and to support himself, he decided to apply for a military pension in 1891 on the basis of these disabilities, which he claimed were a result of his service to his country while serving at Contraband Hospital during the war. Though the poor conditions at the Contraband Hospital did result in sickness among residents and staff, and most likely exacerbated any existing conditions, the pension commission wasn't satisfied that his disabilities were a direct result of his war service. And they claimed that because he was a acting assistant surgeon on contract, that he wasn't eligible So he continued to seek a pension for 24 years. As the pension rules changed, it started that your injuries and sickness had to be a direct result of the war. Then it changed that old age could be pensionable. So every time that the pension laws changed, he reapplied. But for 24 years, he tried to get a pension, and he was denied a pension. Next. After 1891, Powell spent some time in Philadelphia and Baltimore, and eventually his circumstances led him back to Liverpool in 1902. Next. He went back to Liverpool to tend to his dying brother, who was still living there. And after his brother's death, he eventually found some employment for a few years as a chemist's assistant before he fell ill. So he went back to the apothecary pharmacy business. Now, according to Powell, after his recovery, his employer refused to rehire him. His employer said he was too old, he had bad eyesight, he was deaf, and his health was failing. So he was never able to engage in gainful employment after that. Powell remained in Liverpool until his death in 1916 at the age of 82. Next. Now, Anderson Abbott, he became the third surgeon in charge after Augusta and Powell, soon after Powell departed in 1864. He had come to Contraband in June 1863 because he followed in the footsteps of his mentor and friend Alexander T. Augusta. Now, Abbott and Augusta had become friends in Toronto, Canada, where Augusta got his medical degree, and they met there in the late 1850s. Abbott was a native Canadian, born there in 1837, after his family had moved to Canada from the United States. Next. He received his medical training at the Toronto School of Medicine, which was affiliated with the University of Toronto. Next. And in February 1863, he applied to the Secretary of War for a position as a surgeon and received a contract 6 months later as an acting assistant surgeon. Next. Abbott served at Contraband Hospital, and he helped to supervise the move of the hospital in 1864 to the site of Campbell Army Hospital, which was near 7th and Boundary Streets for people that know Washington. And I just want to point out that this diagram is a diagram of the layout of the Contraband Hospital. This diagram was done when Alexander Augusta was trying to get a full-fledged water system at the camp connected to the city's main water main. Up until that point when he was trying to do this, all they had was a well that was dry most of the time and really contributed to the illnesses. So this drawing was done as part of that plan to bring a water source from the city main. And it really does show the layout of the camp. And when you compare this to descriptions given by nurses that served there, it matches pretty well. So in 1864, the camp moved from its original site to the site of Campbell Army Hospital, which really provided, like 600 beds, so it was a better facility. At that time, the control of the hospital transferred from the Army Medical Department to the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, better known as the Freedmen's Bureau, and that's when it became known as Freedmen's Hospital. Now, although Abbott was now working for the Freedmen's Bureau, he still maintained his contract with the Army as a surgeon. Next. This is an entry in the Medical Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, which shows Abbott as the surgeon at Freedmen's Hospital performing an amputation in 1866 on a civilian who had suffered frostbite to both legs and feet. So there's another evidence of his treatment of patients and service there. So while serving in Washington, Alexander Augusta and Anderson Abbott were part of an elite group of African Americans that had really unprecedented access to social and political circles. They were fairly well known. They were new surgeons, new African American surgeons there. Next. And in February 1864, both of them attended a White House reception known as a levee, where they met President Abraham Lincoln, and their attendance there stunned most of the people that were guests. Later in his life, Abbott recalled his experience there, and he said that after being warmly greeted by the president, when they came into the reception line, they moved to another room. Next. The moment we entered the room, we became the cynosure of all eyes. We could not have been more surprised ourselves, nor could we have created more surprise if we had been dropped down upon them through the skylight. Wherever we went, a space was cleared for us, and we became the center of a new circle of interest. Some stared at us merely from curiosity, others with an expression of friendly interest, while others again scowled at us in such a significant way that left no doubt as to what views they held the Negro question. Next. Abbott also became close friends with Elizabeth Keckley, who you may know was the seamstress and confidant to First Lady Mary Lincoln. Next. On the night of Lincoln's assassination, distraught Mary Lincoln sent a messenger to Elizabeth Keckley requesting that she come to her at the Peterson house where the dying president had been taken after he was shot. And according to Anderson Abbott, he accompanied Keckley because they were friends and they knew people and lived part of the time in the same boarding house. He accompanied Keckley and he described their arrival at the house. He said, "A cordon of military was drawn up there, but a card to Mrs. Lincoln furnished an open sesame for us. It was a 3-story brick house opposite the theater, in one room of which was the dying president, while his companion was lying in an adjoining room, prostrate with anguish." So Abbott accompanied Keckley there, and then he soon returned to his lodgings that evening, only to learn of the president's death the next morning. Next. Now, in contrast to Powell's tumultuous leadership at the hospital, Abbott had a much more successful term as a chief administrator. His abilities as a medical professional and hospital administrator at the Contraband Hospital, they were acknowledged and praised by his white surgeons. Major General Kars, who was the assistant superintendent of the Freedmen's Bureau, he sent a letter to Abbott thanking him for his service, and he said he expressed his pleasure and satisfaction in addressing the skillful manner in which you have discharged the duties of your position. Allow me to say, without desiring to flatter, that I consider you the most skillful of any surgeon ever in charge of this post. Next. Cable Horner was the chief medical officer of the Freedmen's Bureau, and he was drawn to Abbott's ability early on, noting in a letter that Abbott's, quote, efficiency soon gained him the promotion to the position of surgeon in charge. He has continued to discharge with credit to himself and the entire satisfaction of his superior officers, duties involving professional and administrative responsibilities. Anderson Abbott remained at Freedman's Hospital as surgeon in charge until he resigned in 1866, a year after the war ended. There were several other African-American physicians that served under Abbott during that time, including next, John H. Rapier Jr., next, and Charles Purvis. John H. Rapier Jr. Served there as assistant. Charles Purvis of Pennsylvania, he first served there as a nurse, and once he got his medical degree, had a contract as a contract surgeon. Next. After Abbott left the Army Medical Service, he returned to Toronto. He got married and he set up a medical practice. He was appointed the first Black coroner in Canada in 1874, and then he retired in 1881. He came out of his retirement in 1891 when he and his wife moved to Chicago, and he assumed the position of the medical superintendent at Provident Hospital and Training School for Nurses, replacing its founder, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who had taken a position at Freedman's Hospital. Now, Provident Hospital and Training School for Nurses was the first Black-owned and operated hospital in the United States. It provided training for doctors as well as a training school for nurses, because once African Americans got a medical degree, they weren't permitted to practice in any hospitals or treat any patients. So this is why the African American physicians really needed to provide and run and own and operate their own hospitals. In 1897, Abbott resigned from Provident, returned to Canada a few years later, and he spent the remainder of his life writing, teaching, and lecturing. He died in 1913 at the age of 76. Next. There were, that's a picture of Provident Hospital and Training School in Chicago. Next. There were 4 other African Americans that served at Contraband that I'll talk about. John Rapier Jr. He served for 14 months. He got a degree at Keokuk Medical College in Iowa, and he began serving there in 1864. Charles Purvis, who got his medical degree at Worcester Medical College, he first served as a nurse, as I mentioned, in 1864, and then just after the war ended in 1865, he joined as a physician. He maintained a long-term relationship with Freedmen's after the war, including serving as a professor for Howard University Medical College and on the board there. William Ellis got a degree from Dartmouth, and he was there beginning in 1864, served for 9 months. And Alpheus Tucker went to Oberlin College and Keokuk Medical College as well, and began serving there in 1865 for 6 months. Next. Now, Contraband Hospital, and subsequently called Freedmen's Hospital, it endured through the Civil War and into the 21st century as Howard University Hospital, not only because of the needs of the community, but really because of the women and men who dedicated themselves to the hospital's survival. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner is an older from 1900, 1908 Freedmen's Hospital, and it's the same building. The building still exists, and it actually does still say Freedmen's Hospital on it. Next. There were several surgeons, as I mentioned, who served during the Civil War that remained at the hospital. These are Alexander Augusta, Charles Purvis, and Anderson Abbott. Next. Some became members of the medical college faculty, and Freedmen's Hospital eventually became the teaching hospital for Howard University's Howard University's medical department. And eventually, in 1961, I think it was, President Kennedy transferred it to Howard University, and it formally became Howard University Hospital in the early 1970s when they built a new hospital building. You can see Augusta on the left and Purvis on the right in that lower photo of the faculty from like 1869, 1870. Next. 12 of the 14 African-American men who served as surgeons during the Civil War, they were born in America, but they lived during a time when their choice of a career as a physician was not considered acceptable because of their color. They were confronted with many challenges and obstacles throughout their lives, but they really faced them with determination, persistence, and dedication. Some were forced to pursue a medical education outside the United States, but all were determined to become physicians. And when their country was in need, they served gallantly and with pride, and they each contributed in their own way to the cause for freedom. I want to just end with this one quote that comes from a book called The Story of Freedmen's Hospital. And I like it because I think it's a testament to the longevity. It says, the hospital's ability to withstand the test of time, as I mentioned, can be best articulated by this quote. It owed its longevity most of all to the dedication of those who committed their careers to its survival and growth. They refused to let the nation forget that this was no ordinary hospital, but part and symbol of a larger commitment to those America had enslaved and grudgingly freed. And out of the 14 known surgeons, there are at least 7 that had some service at that hospital. And thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has. Okay. And thank you for all the nice comments coming across the screen.
Yes, and thank you, Jill. Excellent program, and I'm sorry about the tech problems we're having today.
Well, as long as people didn't mind me saying next, we're good to go.
It was fine. It worked out. I just wanted to say that obviously this history program is in honor of Black History Month, as was our program last week. And I would encourage you to take a look at the posts on archiving Wheeling that my colleague Aaron did on Dr. Stilliard, who was a physician here in Wheeling after the war during the Reconstruction period, which is a really good story, a compelling story. So I just wanted to mention that while we're on the subject. And let's see. Have we any questions? Lots of great comments. But
let's see. I just now realize I can see comments.
You can see them, yeah, okay. Yeah, wonderful presentation. Oh, here it is. Here's one. I'll put it up.
I'm getting prompted by my relatives. What is the one thing that most surprised me in my research journey of Black Civil War surgeons? Well, I don't know if it's something that surprised me. When you're researching this type of subject, you really have to delve pretty deep because you just can't go to a book. Hopefully, after my book is published, you can go to a book to find out about these surgeons, but you have to kind of piece it together like a puzzle, and you find one small needle in a haystack that leads you to something else. I think that surprising, I don't know if anything really surprised me in the sense that the expectation of not finding a whole lot and having to dig down was not surprising. But I was surprised at some of the places where people got medical degrees, because they did get medical degrees at Yale and Dartmouth. But as well, one of the surprising things is that there were 4 of them that got medical degrees in Iowa at a place called Keokuk Medical College. But they had different names, but that's the one that resonates in most of the documents. And I find that surprising because here were 4 African American men at a medical school in Iowa over the same period of time, like 64, 65. And it's a little bit surprising and intriguing for me. And I'm still kind of trying to delve into that to learn more about that location and why they were drawn there and why they would have 4 African Americans at that school. Because most of the time when African Americans applied to the medical school, once they found out they were African American, they told them to either leave, and in some cases they were allowed to stay. So it was a mixed bag. Most of the time they were not accepted. So that was, I guess that would be the most surprising thing.
I think you answered this question, which is about books, and you said there weren't any, but you're writing one?
Yes, there are a few. Yes, I'm writing one. I'm hoping it'll be published sometime next year. That will talk about all 14 of these African American surgeons and talk about their lives and their service. You can find some books have chapters. Margaret Humphreys wrote a book called Intensely Human about the health of the Black soldier. There's a chapter there about that mentions some surgeons. There's another small book that does, but what I've done is I'm very particular about research, and if there's something I'm going to say about a surgeon, I want to make sure that I can corroborate it with some evidence, because some of the things out there, it started with there are 9. As more research is done, another book said 11, and I'm up to 14. So there could be others out there. I have not been able to identify any others more than the 14.
Yeah, having evidence is a good thing. Here's an interesting question, so I'll put that one up.
How did Lincoln personally feel? I really don't know. When there's nothing that I have been able to find where Lincoln mentions these surgeons. Obviously, Edwin Stanton was aware of them and was the one that said, yes, let them take the test. His signature appears on some of the notes and things that I found in the archive. So I know that he was aware of it and made that possible. But it's interesting that the 7 surgeons that were at Camp Stanton wrote this letter to Lincoln saying, hey, you got to do something about this. We never signed up for this. This is a disgrace, basically. No evidence that there was any response, but we do know that Augusta was transferred, so somebody made that decision. Okay. So I also see another note that says, have any family members of the African American surgeons reached out to you as a result of this work? No. I spent a little bit of time during my research trying to see if I can connect to contemporary. Well, let me step back. I have to change my answer. Okay. I reached out to them. There is a woman, Anderson Abbott's great great granddaughter, Catherine Slaney, wrote a book about her family called Crossing the Color Line. And it was about her journey of discovering her Black Canadian family, which she knew nothing about. So she's the one relative of one of these surgeons that I've connected with. She came down here to give a talk. We've corresponded. She's provided me with some research materials. So that's really the only one. I do believe that there are family members out there, but I haven't had anybody contact me. And I did meet some relatives. I gave a talk in New Bedford, Massachusetts at the National Park location there about William Powell, because his family came from there. And there were some distant relatives that were still living there that actually came to the presentation, but not a direct relative to William Powell specifically, but through his mother's side of the family.
Excellent. Well, Jill, thank you once again for superb program, very informative, and we appreciate that.
And I appreciate the opportunity. Right now, I'm working with a publisher. I'm hoping 2022. Right now, it's called Without Compromise, Without. Boy, I don't even remember the name of my own book. I'm going to look it up.
Names of books change before they get published.
Yeah, Without Concealment, Without Compromise. African American surgeons in the Civil War. And I chose that because Without Concealment, Without Compromise is I believe it's it is the standard for a Black abolitionist newspaper. And I felt that title really lends itself to their story, because in most cases, for them to have persevered through medical school and served in the army and did what they wanted to do with their lives in that way, they had to do it really without compromising and without concealing their desires and their belief in equality.
Another question popped up that I think we can guess at the answer.
Yes. What's interesting is I believe that the surgeons were paid the same amount. They got paid $100 a month. And then if they were working in the field, it was $113, I think. And if you think about it, in 1863, 64, that was a lot of money, $100 a month. Now, Alexander Augusta did have a problem with that at one time when he went to the person who disperses the payment, and they were going to pay him the $7 that the Black soldiers that enlisted were not paid the same as white soldiers, but I believe the surgeons were. And so he protested, and they had to go through, they did push through legislation, I think, to get the salaries of the Black soldiers, and I think they included them. But they got paid $100 a month, which I think is the same for white surgeons.
Very good. Any additional questions before we sign off? While we wait, I just wanted to mention again, Thursday evening, our science program continues with Dr. Cephallus Vargas, physics, fundamentals thereof from Newton to Einstein. And so we're going to cover all that in one night. That'll be great. Stacy has a tough job. The following Tuesday, our book about coal miners and black lung disease. And then the week after that, we will have Crystal Wilkinson, who's a very fine fiction writer from Kentucky. We'll be doing our Ann Thomas Memorial program, the second one that we've done. So that'll be February 23rd. And let's see, I have a message before I sign off.
That's from me.
That's from you.
I just want to, I'll just say, I want to thank everybody for all their nice, kind comments. And I'd like to thank my family members who joined this live talk.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who tuned in. And yes, congratulations. And thank you again, Jill. And
Thank you.
see you all Thursday.
Thank you.